Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on August 29th with Marilyn Thompson. She will be giving a presentation on state military record resources. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Maureen Brady on Scottish family history research, Beyond the Basics. Before we begin, here's a little bit about Maureen. Maureen Brady, a former school librarian and computer educator, has 40 years experience with family history research. She has traced her Scottish roots back to the end of the 17th century and beyond, and has also pursued Chicago and the Midwest, the Trans-Allegheny US, Quebec, Irish, and Swedish research. Maureen has made numerous presentations to genealogical societies, libraries, conferences, and workshops throughout the US, as well as presenting for the Brigham Young University Library Family History Webinar Series. She is a member of the Genealogical Speakers Guild, as well as a life member of the Aberdeen and Northeast Scotland Family History Society and the Ohio, Chicago, and McHenry County, Illinois Genealogical Societies. She is also active in the Kentucky, Middle Tennessee, and Lake County, Illinois Genealogical Societies, the British Interest Group of Wisconsin and Illinois, and the Chicago Scots Genealogical Group. And we will now turn the time over to Maureen if she's ready.
Thank you, Olivia. Okay. So this particular presentation on Scottish research, we're going to be looking at not the church records, the civil registration, or the census. Those are the basics, the ones you need to start with. This is going to be looking at, once you've done the church records, the civil registration, and the census, and you've done all of your collateral lines in all three of those record sources, then you need to start looking at other sources which are going to be perhaps harder to find, may or may not be indexed. Usually I'm looking at the ones online, but some may not. And so these are the things you need to start thinking about. And none of all of these are not going to be applicable to any one research problem. You're going to have to pick and start with the ones that are most likely to help you with your research. In this particular thing also, that you need to have a good, strong geographical context of how Scotland has been divided in the past and where the records might be kept. So we're going to first look at the landform map for Scotland so that you get an idea of how mountainous it is if you've never been there. So we've got the Highlands up here, which is almost exclusively highland and little sea locks coming in from this side and this side, some rivers coming into there, but you can notice very little farmland. This is going to be mostly people who are subsistence farmers, crofters with under 5 acres of land, or fishing folk, or work as a merchant or tradesman in one of the small little fishing villages. Then we have this big wraparound section of lowland, which is really the agricultural area of Scotland, but because there's all the seacoast, there's also a lot of fishing going on over here, and we have some major rivers that come in fairly deeply into the country, and those are going to be also major areas of transportation and movement. And then we've got this Grampian Mountain. These are the highest mountains in the British Isles, on the British Isles in Great Britain. And they have Ben Nevis here because that's the one that's by Loch Lomond, and sometimes people know that particular name, but we have much higher mountains up in here. And some of these roads are closed in the winter because of the amount of snow that these mountains particularly can get. Then we come down here with this green band, which comes across the middle of the country, Edinburgh to Glasgow. And this area is actually a fault line that kind of divides the two areas of mountains. And then we get up into the mining area of the southern uplands. Very quick overview of the landforms of Scotland and why somebody couldn't go from here to here very easily. They would have had to go around or over the mountains, and most people didn't do that because there really weren't roads. Now take a look at county boundaries. This becomes confusing, and it's one of my criticisms of Family Search with their effort to standardize local place names. In Scotland, it becomes extremely important to know the date of an event to be able to determine what the county would have been. So after 1996, this is the county pattern for Scotland. They reduced it down to 32, I believe it is. And you can see Aberdeen is very big, and I'm going to compare that one in a few minutes to what it used to look like. And Aberdeen City, as a city, is by itself, so is Dundee and Edinburgh and so on. So this is today's boundaries. Now I'm pointing this out because if you're entering data in Family Search and it asks for the standardized form and you go searching, it's going to sometimes come up with today's boundaries for a given place. So watch that very carefully, that you're picking the correct geographical name for a parish or town for the time frame your event occurred. Then between 74 and 96, they didn't have counties at all. They had regions, and these were very large regions, as you can see. And my family comes from Aberdeen mostly, and I've caught myself when I go in and do a search and want to enter Aberdeen as a place name, sometimes my first option is Aberdeen, Grampian, Scotland. And that's totally incorrect unless it occurred between 74 and 96. So again, these dates become important. The ones, though, that you're going to really probably zero in on are the 19th century and earlier county boundaries. This is a map of it in color, and I show you this in color so it makes it a little easier to understand how some of these counties were chopped up, if you will. Take a look at this one up here. This is number 3A. The green is 3. And these 3As, all of these little pockets of red, are one parish that are not connected to each other, that are surrounded by 3. And who knows why they did it, but that's how they did it up until 1890. So if you were living in this little place up here, then you were not in 3, you were in 3A. Down here, you'll see that 6 is divided. Look at 5 here. And even down here, there's 18 is in kind of this little pocket. So you have to be careful of county boundaries, and something may not make sense. Take a look at 7, and way over here, there's a little pocket of it. This is Banffshire, I believe. Yes, that's Banffshire. And up till 1890, there was a little pocket of Banffshire over here on the East Coast that actually, this was where their parish church was. And they probably never went to church there, but that was their assigned church. So be aware of it. It's why I'm showing it to you, and be very careful that you're picking the correct title of the county or region for the time frame of your event. So let's move on to what is a parish. Now, in Scotland, a parish has kind of funky boundaries in a way, and if that's an old-fashioned word, my apologies. Here's the county of Aberdeenshire as it was before 1890, and you can see it goes almost up to it does go up to the coast, except for that little pocket of Banffshire that I told you there. This is fairly much along the River Dee, and so on. And we have a lot of little tiny parishes here, and we have very large one down here. This is the agricultural lower level coastland, which is mostly good farmland, beautiful farmland. They grow a lot of grains and some what they would call soft fruit, which would be like raspberries. As they move inland, this becomes much more mountainous. So the smaller parishes, it's not because there's more people. It's because it's harder to get from where you live to the church that you're assigned to and the area that you're supposed to go to register your births, marriages, and deaths, and so on. So these are smaller, mostly because of constraints of geography and landform. And then as you get out here, these are going to be because there's not enough people to support a church without making it a much larger area. Plus, there might be better roads, or there might be better ways to go along rivers and streams to get to church. So this is the boundaries of all of the parishes of Aberdeenshire before 1890. And you'll see that some of these, here's Cabrick, there's Kearney. Another weird thing about this is that the parish of Kearney actually goes up into Banffshire. And there's a church down here on the Aberdeen side, and there's a church up here on the Banffshire side. Before 1890, it was officially an Aberdeen parish. And then after 1890, it became a Banff parish. So you'd also have to be aware of those kinds of things. And the best way to figure all that out is using the Family Search Wiki. Now, in the maps, and I talked about maps a little bit in your handout, and I'll show you some more examples later on. There are two excellent sets of maps that you can get through the Ordnance Survey website on your internet. And there's two scales. Now, this is Ordnance Survey 1 to 50,000, and it's pretty detailed. You see all the little farm settlements here. You see some of the main roads, even the secondary roads. You might see some tracks that go off into various places. So this looks pretty detailed, and it is, for most part, the map would be very useful for your research. But take a look at the 1 to 25. Now we're looking at not just the roads, but we're actually looking at the stone fences that divide the farms. So, and we also see not just, if I go back one, you'll see here we've got bog feckle and mains of bog feckle. Well, if I go to the 1 to 25, we've also got the hill of feckle, the mill of feckle, and so you can see how this can all be broken down into even smaller places of residence. These are called farm towns in Scotland. These are little clusters of farm buildings and dwellings that are not a town in the sense that we might think of it, but they are where the workers live. And in this case, it's around a mill or a hill. And so all of this, though, would be the estate of Feckle. And you'll see how that works later on. So there are two sets of maps. If you order them from the Ordnance Survey, they are excellent and they're very reasonable in cost. But you want the 1 to 25, not the 1 to 50, if you can find a map of that scale. The other thing to be aware of, especially if you are looking at church records, or for that matter, civil registration, or you find a family letter and you see references to Drum or Fitty or Green Dykes or Old Moss, these are also the names of those little clusters of farm buildings scattered around an estate. And they may or may not be the name of a town or a state or anything. It's just what those little buildings were called. So be aware that this is not going to be a town. None of these are towns. These are all parts of a parish, and it's identifiable as a specific part of a parish, and it's going to show up in all of the records that you're going to be looking at. Another thing to be aware of, again, if you're looking especially at a family letter, is they're going to use nicknames a lot. And I have a family letter where my third great grandfather references Fogey Loan. And where's Fogey Loan? What is that? So of all places, I go to Google, and Google takes me to the Wikipedia, which tells me that Abercurter, this is how it looks in Gaelic, is locally known as Fogey Loan or Fogey, and it's a village on the A97 road. So that then gives me, okay, my fifth, third great grandfather is referring to his daughter living in Abercorder, but he called it Fogielone. So if you get one of these tricky ones that you can't find any reference to in Scotland's people or Scotland's places or in a wiki, or rather in the family search wiki, then just try Google and you'll probably get the answer. All right, a couple of other places that I'll help you with this geographical puzzle. One is Genuki. The URL is in your handout, and it stands for the genealogy of the United Kingdom and Ireland. So that's where the name comes from. And you can go in and pick any country, and then you can zero in on counties and so forth. They have all of these topics covered with the background of each one and perhaps how parish boundaries may affect them. But once you pick a county, it actually gives you a description from the 1887 Gazetteer of Scotland on where this place is, what borders it, what churches are in there, and so forth. So it gives these really excellent hints as to where the records might be, and if they maybe live right next to the other parish, maybe you might want to check for a missing baptism there, or even perhaps a marriage. And then you can see down here we have the parishes of Stirlingshire, so you can go in and zero in and go to Kippen, and you get the same description from a gazetteer. This one happens to be from the Statistical Account of Scotland. And there's also a book about Kippen Village. And then it not only shows you this, you see here, click here to view the map. And this is what the map looks like. And this is today's map. This is not old map, but you do get a sense of where Kippen is. And you can see some of the older names out here in the country. So you can say, oh, well, maybe I should go look for Middle Kerse, or maybe I should go look for Seti or Claylands. It at least gives you some hints of what some of these farms were in the area that you might then be able to match up with a record. So that's the geography of most of it. National Library of Scotland also has a whole series of different kinds of maps. This is their homepage for maps. Again, the URL is in your handout. And you can play around with this. You can do a map finder, and then it'll get you into the particular 1 to 50 or 1 to 25,000 map. You can also look at browse by map maker. But one of the neat things here is it'll actually do a side-by-side viewer. So it will give you a current satellite version and a map version of a same area. And you can pull this across and go back and forth and compare today's satellite to the old map. Very, very useful when there are streets that disappear and that sort of thing. So and this is an example of one of the maps that they have. And I like this one because they color the lower land and the upper land so you can get a better sense of what this particular parish looked like. This is Old Meldrum. Here's Inverurie. So there's a couple of different towns and parishes here, but you get an idea that here's why the road goes through here, because we've got highland there and highland here. So we're going to build a road this way. And at the top of this highland is our parish boundary. And so this is one parish and this is another parish and so on. So these maps become very useful and quite crucial to understand where people may have gone, how they met their spouses, why a baby was baptized in a church that maybe is closer to where home is, and so on. So moving on to historical context. First, let's talk a little bit about who settled what we call Scotland today. Now, first of all, County Down is 20 miles across the Irish Sea from the southwest coast of Scotland. Norway is only 90 miles across the North Sea from the northeast knuckle, as I call it, this northeast point. So there's only 90 miles to Norway this way. There's only 20 miles to County Down, Ireland here. So in the early years, outside of the natives who were settled in this area was settled by Irish immigrants, if you will, who came across the Irish Sea and started to settle this west coast area of Scotland. And the Norwegians, Vikings or not, then the Irish called it Dalriada. The Vikings settled up here in the Orkneys and Shetland and brought their customs, and especially their naming customs, with them. So up until the 1880s, these are going to be patronymic names as you would find in Scandinavia. And there is a wiki article, Family Search wiki article on patronymics if you're not familiar with that. But talking about the others, what the rest of this area, who settled them? So let's take a look. The earliest group that has been named in the records are the Picts. They were primarily up here in the Northeast. There are stone circles and actually cave drawings and things of that sort. Excuse me a minute. I apologize, but I'm having dry throat from allergies today. So the Picts were up here at the same time as the Roman Empire was occupying the island of Great Britain. And as the Roman legions came up from England, they got to this point, and then they got up here, and they started to run into these strange people who didn't dress. They were usually fairly nude, and they painted their bodies with blue tattoos. And so the Roman scholars of the time called them Picts. The Picts left no records, no language, at least that we can have a group of body of words that we can translate symbols. They did a lot of symbol writing, and there are lots of symbols into stone and monuments all over this portion of Northeast Scotland. But it's been a real trial understanding what those pictographs mean. So this area is, yes, we know they existed. And in fact, there is a DNA study that Oxford College did once that identifies this particular part of Scotland as having unique DNA from the rest of Great Britain. So this is an area that has very old and deep roots. There's just no records. The next one we need to talk about are the Norse and Vikings up here in Orkneys and then further north Shetland. Then we have the Britons coming from Brittany in France, and they came up by way of, down here is the Irish Sea and then the English Channel further south, and settled in the middle area here, bringing their form of Gaelic with them, as well as a form of what became German. And then we had the Angles, which was a reference to not the English as we would think of it, but Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons coming out of southwestern Great Britain. And then we had Dalriada with the Irish coming across this way. And then up in this part, it is kind of a mixture of the Irish, the Norse, and the Picts. So that's not been identified as a separate group, if you will. So I just call that question mark. We don't know what to call them. But we've got the Norse and Viking elements up here in the far north in the islands, the Picts in this area, the Britons across the middle, and through the border area, we had the Angles, the Anglo-Saxons coming out of southwestern England, and then Dalriada, which were primarily Irish Gaelic speakers. Now, I gave you a rather, in your handout, a rather lengthy list of important dates, but these are the key ones when we're talking about records. The Reformation began in Scotland about 1560. At first, it was centered in Edinburgh and Glasgow and somewhat in Dundee and Aberdeen, where the major population centers were, and they had universities and so on. But gradually it did spread across the entire country. However, a lot of Catholicism stayed. There are some areas of Scotland that even today are more Catholic, if you will, than Presbyterian. The other thing about the Reformation is because the Scots are very independent thinkers, and we aren't going to accept your interpretation of something. We can interpret it ourselves, and we don't agree with what you're saying, so we're going to go off and start our own group. And it happens a lot in the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. So in 1638, there was a push by the King of England, who felt he was in control. This was after James the First of England, who was also James the Sixth of Scotland, became monarch. In the middle of that century, there was an effort to convert the Presbyterians in Scotland to start using the English Book of Common Prayer, to use the English form, and to use the English form where your own local congregation didn't pick your minister, but a bishop somewhere did, and so on. So there was a group that signed this national covenant in 1638, landowners, and some of them were titled people, dukes and so on, and took a chance because they knew they were putting their lives on the line and signed this national covenant. They became known as Covenanters, but very quickly they were outlawed and it was illegal to meet in a covenant meeting. And so they would have to meet out in the fields and so on. And a lot of them were imprisoned. Some were actually executed. Then the next one that becomes important is in the 1690s, we have our first tax lists that name names, heads of household primarily, but you're going to see if anyone who's old enough to fight in the militia or pay a tax, they are going to be in these hearths and poll tax lists of the 1690s. And what exists is, we'll talk about in a little bit where you can find them. In 1783 to 1794, you may recognize 83 as the end of the American Revolution, and the English Parliament lost the right to tax the colonies in North America. And so they moved the Stamp Act effectiveness from the American colonies over to Great Britain. And so the Stamp Act became effective for those 11 years. And the main effect here is that it charged a family to register a baptism. So families opted out of registering any baptisms of their children in this 11-year period. Now, marriages, yes, they did marriages because they had to make the children legal. They had to do the legality of it. But children's baptisms, that wasn't a legal act. And so they just opted not to put it in the church registers, and you aren't going to find anybody. Or you may find one, maybe the first one or something like that. So if you have a difficulty in this 11-year period, this might be why. In the 1785 to 1820 era, we have the Highland clearances, and I'll talk about that a little later. But essentially, that was an effort to clear the population out of Caithness and Sutherland and Ross and Cromarty to replace them with sheep. The first census with everyone in the household named is 1841. 1843, there is a major division of the Presbyterian Church with the disruption, as they called it, and it's the creation of the Free Church of Scotland. So there is a period between 1843 and 1855 when civil registration takes over that, again, you're going to have difficulty finding marriages as well as the baptisms because people dropped out of the established Church of Scotland, the mainline Presbyterian, and moved over to the Free Church. The Free Church records, though, are starting to appear on Scotland's people. So you might start filling in that 12-year gap. And then in 55, they start civil registration of all births, marriages, and deaths, which of course continues to today. Talking about religious patterns. So the Reformation began about 1560. And as I mentioned, but we had a lot of movement. So we had the Covenanters in 1638. Then we had Oliver Cromwell in power between 1653 and 1658, especially, but before and after, there was there was civil war. There was a lot of turmoil politically within the British Isles. And as a consequence, and to protect their people, meant most, if not all, in certain areas of the ministers chose not to keep a register. So if you have a very early register, say up to the 1640s, and then suddenly nothing until the 1670s, it's because it's during this period with all this political uproar and people were just not writing anything down that could be found by somebody. And then finally, we had the major disruption in 1843 that I just mentioned. So you have three major events within the Presbyterian Church that affected where the records were or were not. But in addition, there were probably another 50 or 60 small little offshoots. There are so many that you can't even chart it. So they may have been Presbyterian by the time you see them and find them in the 1850s. But if you go back another 200 years, you suddenly can't find anything because of either they're an offshoot or it's because of these major events. We also need to talk about nonconformity. Now, in Scotland, nonconformity refers to any religious body that is not the established Church of Scotland, not Presbyterian, but part of the established church. So the Free Church is certainly nonconformist, but so is the Church of England, so is the Methodists and the Quakers and the Baptists and the Congregationalists and the Roman Catholics. Anyone whose church was not an established Church of Scotland were considered to be nonconformists. And so as you go into especially the church records before 55, and this Kirk Session records I'll mention later, you'll see references to a marriage in non-conforming marriage. And it simply means that the marriage took place in a place other than the established church. It sounds a little confusing because we think of non-conforming as, well, in my terms, a hippie of the 60s, but it doesn't mean that. It refers to it's a not established Church of Scotland ceremony. Then we look at the Jacobite period, which is the first half of the 18th century and the clearances of the last half of the 18th century and over into the beginning of the 19th. And this is the best picture I could show to describe what happened at the end of the Jacobites. The Jacobites were the supporters of those Stuart king descendants who were trying to reclaim the throne of Scotland and England at that point. But on August 1st, 1745, there was a law written and read in the churches from the pulpit. This was a Sunday, I guess, or close to it, that prescribed, as they called it in English definitions of the word, anything to do with the Highland culture. It meant the dress, the music, the language, anything that was from the Highland culture became illegal to demonstrate, practice, wear, mention, anything of that sort. The English Parliament was trying to absolutely subjugate the clan system of the Highlands because they were such strong fighters up there and constantly a problem to the English Parliament. And so they thought this might solve the issue. For the period of time, the balance mostly of the 18th century, you are not going to find references to Highland culture in anything official until George III took a trip to Edinburgh and decided he wanted to wear tartan. And suddenly it became okay to wear tartan and kilts and play bagpipes and all that sort of thing. And it was just an arbitrary thing on his part, and suddenly everybody just jumped back into it. So for a period of time, it was prescribed that you couldn't show any part of Highland culture. And the other thing is the Highland clearances. This is the cover of a book that I have in your bibliography that I highly recommend you read. And this was an effort, a very organized effort on the part of English landlords to clear their lands of all of the residents, completely clear them of human beings, and then replace it with sheep, because the sheep were very, very profitable. And if sheep like to roam, they were free range, so houses and walls and things like that would get in the way. So they wanted to clear everyone out. Some of the people were given new residences and occupations in some of the small towns on the seashore. Some were put on ships and transported anywhere you want to name. And some of them were lucky enough, they just kept going east and ended up in Murray, Banffshire, Kincardine, Aberdeenshire, or south into Perthshire. It's impossible to follow the families back from those areas, other than to say, when you look at the history of a surname and it comes out of Caithness or Sutherland or Ross and Cromarty, you have a good suspicion that they were part of these Highland clearances. This book is fantastic, real easy read, and just opens your eyes to the whole thing. So that's the historical. Now we talk a little bit about social context, and the first thing is language. This is Robert Burns, his famous poem To a Haggis. And I'm not going to try to read it because I'm not good at that with the accent and all that sort of thing. But you can see if you read this and you're going to go, what in the world is this saying? Well, not only is this old words that we maybe wouldn't use anymore in modern English, but it's the pronunciation or the way they thought it was pronounced and the way then how it was spelled. So this one, for instance, is about. That's what we would look at and say it's about. This is long. That's not hard to figure out. It's lang, long, so on. But some of this is what in the world? And this is only the beginning of his very long poem. So we have the Scots language as it developed. It was a dialect variant of English done in the time or created in the time or appeared in the time of roughly Middle English. So think Shakespeare. And then we have Doric. And these are all Doric words that some of those you might know, like byre. You may know that that's a cowshed. But I doubt very much that you know that a quine is a young girl or young woman. You might know bide and bairn. Fit like is how you doing in Doric. And clapshot is the name of a dish made out of mashed potatoes and mashed turnips mixed together. It is a common side dish in that northeast knuckle where the Picts came from. So Doric goes back so far in time that we really aren't sure the origins of it, but it is very common as a household language. Now, the schools still teach in English, but at home, on the playground, in the shops, they speak Doric. And quite recently, in the last few years, the educational system has now brought Doric into the schools and is actually teaching it in the classroom. And they have now actually given the students permission to write their essays in Doric, where before it was required they had to do it in English. So Doric is very much the fourth language of Scotland. So we have English, Gaelic, Scots, and Doric. But the other problem is when you get them all mixed up, meaning in the same person, in a sentence, a letter, conversation may have words that come from all three of those origins. So we have skiandu, which is Gaelic, Adiniken, that's Doric, Slanja, Gaelic, Loon, Doric, Bra comes from all of them. And then we have our New Year's greeting of Lang may your lum reek. Well, the Lang is from Scots and the lum is from Doric and reek is from Scots. So you have this combination all over the country. When you see a letter or something written vernacularly, it can even show up in the church registers themselves that it comes as a combination of all of the influences of language in Scotland. And so it's really hard to know sometimes what the reference might be. And again, I rely on Google and Wikipedia to help me figure some of these out. In your handout, I developed a short little glossary of some of the words I have found in the registers and the Kirk session records to help you define what some of these may mean. And there's also 2 Scottish glossary references at the end of the glossary to also help you figure some of this out. And just as an example of pronunciation, sometimes they're just pronouncing basic English words. So this is a bonny Heelan coo. You don't say Highland cow, you say Heelan coo. You go to any Scottish event where there's cattle or even sometimes a petting zoo with one of these animals, and no one is going to call it a Highland cow. Everyone says it's a Heelan coo. So it's pronunciation of English words is also different. And the dialects around Scotland are as varied as the valleys and the mountains that divided people from one glen to another. So as examples of things that you might find in the records that are not spoken, but these are the actual church records, a few is the lease that you received, and it's based on the old feudal system of you had a lease or a right to farm a piece of property or work at a mill or something from the laird of the manor. A dry stain diker. Dry stain means it's stone, but put together without mortar, and a diker is somebody who builds a wall. So it's a wall built out of stone without mortar. Clandestine marriage was any marriage in a non-conformist place. So in the Established Church of Scotland Presbyterian records, if they weren't married by that parish minister, it is a clandestine marriage. It doesn't mean it was an elopement. It doesn't mean it was done in secret. It just means it wasn't done by the established church minister. And a glebe is a grant of land granted to the minister, the schoolmaster, as a way to supplement his salary from his position. These are all in my glossary, so you don't need to worry about remembering it. Then we have names and naming patterns. The Scots, as most countries, have lots, they love to just spell their names any old way. So we have the basic surname Mackintosh, which can be spelled in any of these forms. As we get into more modern times, sometimes they just use that the apostrophe because they didn't want to spell out MAC or MC. And then I have one branch of my Mackintosh family where the grandson just decided this is too much to write, and he dropped off the entire front, and they became Tosh, and they are still Tosh in that part of Aberdeenshire. So be aware that these changes do occur. If it looks anything close to the surname you're researching, or even the given name you're researching, there's a strong possibility it is the right person and the right name, and you're just going to have to do a little bit more research to prove or disprove. Then we also have the way the names are pronounced. With the influence of Gaelic and the influence of Doric, there's a lot of different ways that people pronounce letters. There's a lot of silent letters in both Doric and Gaelic. And so we have a family name called, and if you asked my great uncle, he would have said he married the Carney girl. And this is how you might have spelled Carney. You might have put an IE at the end, but that's pretty much how most of us would have spelled Carney. But it actually could be spelled this way, and is in fact the actual spelling of the word coming out of the northeast of Scotland, but pronounced Carney, silent D. And then some later generations somehow came up with Cardew for Carney or Cardinal. So there's a lot of differences here that, yes, is that the same name, or no, it's not. And the only way to solve it is to do as much research as possible on that family and see how many different variants of the name that you might come up with. All right, education. Unlike Ireland and unlike England, education, free education for all children beginning at about age 4 was free to every boy and girl within the parish. It was required by the church that every minister set up a school, and if he had to teach it himself, he did. Often they had enough money to hire a schoolmaster to do it, but every parish had an actual school free for every boy and girl from the 1560s up through at least the late 19th century. So it is not an illiterate population. They know how to read. They know how to write. They know how to do math. They know how to sign their names, with one real exception. Glasgow became an area where a lot of Irish came over for better opportunities and employment. And the miners in the south came up from England to mine down there and then eventually into Glasgow. So if you are working in Glasgow records, you will see a lot of X's for people who were illiterate. Over time, that disappears, but there is a period essentially up to about 1870 where you will see a lot of illiteracy, especially in the general Glasgow area of the Southwest. But as you go north and east, you will not find illiteracy. They are people who could read and write, and in some cases could speak both English and Gaelic. All right, statistical accounts of Scotland. This is the last thing I wanted to mention. This is an actual record source. In your handout, I gave you 2 different URLs because the first one was done in the 1790s and the other one was done in 1845. They are on 2 different websites, so they are separate and they are separate records, but you need to look at both depending on when your family lived where the parish is. So this is from the 1790s for the parish of Fyvie. These were a survey of some 20 plus questions that each minister was to answer as he saw proper. And he could answer it in a lengthy answer, or he could give it 1 or 2 sentences. It was up to him. But most of them are quite descriptive and give you a really good feel, not of the persons within the parish, but the size of the parish, the weather in the parish, what crops they grew, what kinds of obstacles to travel there might be. Was there a railroad in 1845? Did they have fuse, or did they have fewing fairs, as they called them, which were hiring markets twice a year? All of this is in the statistical account of Scotland. And if you can read it, you get references to what the people did for a living, how much economy there was, were they all poor, were they middle class, was there a great span between them? There is one that I have from the parish of Ortewell, where the minister in the 1790s mentioned that in the 1760s, there were only 3 men in the village who had a good suit of clothes for Sunday, a watch, and a hat. And that was the laird at the manor, the minister, and the schoolmaster. But in 1790s, when he responded to this survey, all of the men in the parish in that 30-year period had moved up the economic ladder so that every man had a suit of clothes, a hat, and a watch, which gives you a very good picture of what was going on in that 30 years within that parish. Now, here's an example from 1843 from the same parish, and this is miscellaneous observations. So it has many bars to husbandry have been removed. New roads have been cut. Mill mulchers at one time very heavy, amounting to 1/17th part when work was done, and to 1/21st independent of any work, have now for the most part been extinguished. The standard of comfort among the people has become elevated, their ideas less contracted, their knowledge and information more extensive, and so forth. it gives you an example and background to the time frame of when your people lived in that parish. And I cannot emphasize the importance of these statistical accounts. They're both online, free, at 2 different websites in your handout. Now let's look at other sources very quickly in about 7 minutes. First of all, we have the Research Wiki, and you know how to find that. You go up to search, you come down here, pick Research Wiki, and quickly I just wanted to show you in Scotland, if you take the word Scotland, it gives you backgrounds, it gives you some extra articles pertaining to particular records. But over here, we have the Scotland Online genealogy records, which we aren't really going to talk about any of these, but it is a complete list, or a fairly complete list, of all of the databases, the indexes on the major genealogical websites, so including Family Search, but also you can see here's a Find My Past, My Heritage, Ancestry, and so on, and it's broken down by type of record. So here we have late 20th century and early 21st century actual funeral records at Family Search. We have directories, we have immigration records. This is just the beginning of the list. And the other thing is you can also, by county, get an article on the Research Wiki that breaks down all the different kinds of records and where they're kept and whether or not they survived and so on for a given county. And this is pre-1890 county. Shows you where it is over here and so on. There's also an excellent article on reading the old Scottish handwriting. This would be the handwriting in the oldest registers up to about the 1790s, maybe a little bit into the 1800s. And you can see there is a bunch of things down here that can work you through it. Some of them take you to some video lessons and so on. Then Deceased Online, if you've never tried this, Deceased Online is a fee-based website, but they are working with the councils within the British Isles, as includes England and Wales, to transcribe the burial records for the council cemeteries, which is most of the cemeteries on Great Britain. And you can search by name, year, and so on. And just to give you an example, this is my great-great-great-grandfather, Thomas Milne, and he died in June 1881. I do not know why he's listed twice, because in that identical record they show you. But there's a layer. In Scotland, they buried 8 people deep in a particular grave, especially if there were babies, if there were infants, small children. So in this particular grave, which is number 16 in section CY and so on, we have 4 different people: Margaret Milne, Thomas Milne, and an Andrew and a James. And with these dates, it's in civil registration. So the death certificates exist. I can go look these up and I determine, well, that's my 3rd great-grandfather. These are 2 of his grandsons who died as small children. And this is his sister-in-law who married his brother George. So I can put together an entire picture of a family from the layers that are recorded in this Deceased Online. Well worth using. And also I can get a copy of the actual register scan for each one of these individuals, and they can even produce a map to show me where that grave is within a large cemetery. British Newspaper Archive. It works like newspapers.com or Newspaper Archive in the United States, but there is one for the British Isles. And I'm just giving you 2 examples of something that is a sample of what you can get. They do obituaries, but they do children's births, marriages, business news, all sorts of things. So here we have actual telling you who the father is of Lizzie. She's the 6th daughter of George Reddy, who's a farmer in Kenneller. And here we have down William Ross, master builder, banker Eternan, to Elizabeth, the youngest daughter of the late Alexander MacRae in Strachan. And so you get these little ways of little pieces of the tree that you can start putting it together based on the marriage date. It's the 28th of the month, the 23rd of the month. And here's another one. It really have several of these where we have someone died at 2 Kings Gate, Aberdeen on the 29th instant, Margaret Sheriff's wife of Alexander McCrae. This is one of the, if you will, peculiar and lucky things about Scottish research. Women do not lose their maiden names through life. The only time you won't see the maiden name, or often won't, is in the census. But most of the time, anytime they are referred to in a record, and this is actually a death notification, their maiden name will be the reference. Within Scottish culture, she was Margaret Sheriff's, who happened to be married to Alexander McCrae. As another example, my mother's mother was Mary Jane Robertson, who happened to be married to William Hunter. Women did not lose their maiden names in Scottish culture or in the records. Tax records. You go to Scotland's places, and this is in your handout, and it gives you this list of all of these tax records that have been recorded at various times within the government of Scotland. And you pick one, and we're going to look at hearth tax records from 1691 to 1695. Now, you may have remembered when I talked about historical dates that this series is the first time names are actually mentioned in the records for an area, for a parish. And this is what it looks like. These are the heads of the household, or the farmer, or the owner of the mill, or the worker at the mill. And this is this early handwriting, that handwriting will help you decipher. William Lindsay is easy down here. And here's his tax for the hearth. And it could be one hearth. This is probably the manor, the gentleman at the manor, and he has more than one, so he's got 5, and he's taxed 320, where William Lindsay has 2, and he's taxed 18. So it's a list at least of the men of the parish in the 1690s, and it gives you at least an idea of how many families were in that parish of that surname when you're trying to work your way back. Then Scotland's people, they have the statutory registers, and this is all outlined in your handout, the church registers, the census returns. They have wills and testaments, which are primarily 20th century. But the two I want you to really think about are these valuation rolls and the Kirk Session roll. Valuation rolls were taken on the 5s. So 1855, 65, 75, 85, 95, and then 1900 to 1940 every 5 years. And here's the name of the parish. And it tells me that this is the year 1855. The estate of Garysford, which you would see that name on a map, owned by the Reverend George Gary, that is how that's pronounced, who lives in Old Meldrum. These are his tenants, Robert Archibald, and so on. And here's Alexander Forsyth, my 3rd great-grandfather. Here's how much the value of his mill, because it's Mill and Croft of Garysford. And then here's the tax, and then over here is the breakout by land and by mill. So again, it's a list of the farmers, the few holders, the tenants, the people who have land or responsibility enough to need to pay some valuation tax in these 5 years. You are not going to find the farm servants. You're not going to find the plowmen, but you are going to find the millers and the farmers and that sort of thing. And of course, all of the merchants within a town. Then the Kirk Session. This is on Scotland's people, and you identify your parish. These are going to be the old parish names before 1890, and I just chose Ellen, and you can see the breakout. We have accounts, payable and receivable. The communion roll, those members of the area who actually came to church and took communion, and you see how late this goes, 1894. And then the minutes of the Kirk Session. Well, the Kirk Session is the governing body of the established Church of Scotland parish. And they made all decisions regarding anything within that parish, whether or not it was to put glass in the windows of the church because birds were flying in and out, or the poor. So here's quickly 2 examples: a poor list that names people and how much they were given. Maybe sometimes it says just they got shoes or they got cloth to make clothes. And then this is a communicant's roll, a communion roll from 1843. And down here we see Alexander's father, Robert Forsyth, who was a deacon in the church on that date. So it's the kind of thing you can get in the Kirk Session records. That's very quick. So yes, you can do it. And it's already 7 o'clock, so I apologize for that. What are the 2 questions? Okay, why would some Scottish family have moved to Antrim in the early 1700s? Possibly because they were recruited to go there. It is a hard trail to follow, but I would recommend you contact the Ulster Historical Foundation and see what they can come up with in terms of why they would have moved to Antrim at that point in time. And then eventually they went on to South Carolina in 1767. That's very common, but that movement to Antrim is going to be a little hard to follow, and the Ulster Historical Foundation might be able to help. What about Dutchen? How do I determine which clan, etc., it comes from? I put it in my bibliography? Just 1 minute. The first item on the bibliography is George Black's The Surnames of Scotland. It is available in the digital library on Family Search. You would do search books and then do The Surnames of Scotland as a title, and it will come up in a digital format. And I recommend you save it to your own computer so you have it. But he has an excellent dictionary of Scottish names in their variants over time, all the way back to Middle Ages. And that's where I would suggest you start. Also try pronouncing it a bunch of different ways, like maybe the CH is a K. So it's Docken, maybe, or something like that. And when I say it that way, the word that comes to mind is Duncan. So just an idea. So I'm going to stop sharing, going back to Olivia.
All right, thank you so much, Maureen, for answering those questions and for the webinar. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on August 29th with Marilyn Thompson. She will be giving a presentation on state military record resources. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.